This photo shows what was supposed to be Europe's most spectacular new water park, Oceana Waterworld in Gothenburg, Sweden. Just days before its grand opening, the multi-million-dollar project stood complete, pristine, and filled with promise. And this is the same park a few days later, engulfed in flames, shredded by explosions, and blanketed in black smoke visible for kilometers. What happened next would go down as one of the darkest chapters in the history of amusement parks in Sweden, both for the scale of destruction and the tragic loss of life. But first, as always, viewer discretion is advised. In November 2020, in the heart of Gothenburg, a city shaped by maritime history and home to one of Sweden's most beloved amusement parks, a new and ambitious project was about to take shape. Its name was Oceana Waterworld, and from the moment it was announced, it was meant to be far more than just another expansion. The vision that the operating company Liseberg had invested into Oceana was bold: to create the most advanced water park in Scandinavia, one that could operate year-round, withstand Sweden's harsh winters, and set a new standard for indoor leisure across the entire Nordic region. Meanwhile, the design was every bit as striking as the ambition behind it. Combining high-tech engineering with sleek architectural aesthetics, Oceana promised sprawling indoor lagoons, modern wellness zones, and a lineup of record-breaking water slides unlike anything else in the country. By the time the final budget was approved, the project had already surpassed $120 million, and the amount of work ahead was still enormous. Construction moved forward steadily over 4 years, with teams from across the world. Engineers, designers, and specialized contractors, each contributing expertise in everything from hydraulics to structural design. And overseeing this enormous effort, day after day, was one man, 51-year-old Patrik Gillholm. He had been part of the Liseberg team long before Oceana was even conceived, and when the expansion was finally approved, he returned as lead construction manager, bridging planning and execution and overseeing every detail from dawn walkthroughs to late-night reviews. Under his careful supervision, Oceana appeared almost complete by February 2024. The pools had already been sealed and filled for pressure testing. Lighting across the themed zones was being installed and configured, and most of the park's internal systems, from water circulation to HVAC and electrical controls, were online and undergoing collaboration. And perhaps most importantly, the majority of the attractions had already passed their safety inspections. So everything was being prepared at a rapid pace for the long-awaited grand opening in April 2024. However, that readiness existed only on the surface, because on February 12th, something truly catastrophic was about to happen. That Monday morning, most crews were still arriving at the Oceana Waterworld construction site, but as usual, Patrik Gillholm was already there, carrying his clipboard and ready to perform one more series of checks before the day's operations began. He checked in with security shortly after 7 a.m., made a quick round past the ground-level work zones, and then headed directly toward the main tower, the heart of the park's largest slide system and the last active piece still undergoing installation. That attraction, called the Rattler, was styled as a massive serpent coiling around the tower structure. From there, the ride would begin on the 4th floor, launch riders through a series of high-speed tunnels suspended outside the building, and then curve back inside for a dramatic final plunge into the main pool. However, the Rattler was also one of the remaining attractions that had been giving teams trouble for weeks, if not months. Although the slide structure itself had already been assembled, one critical component had delayed final installation: a specialized water diversion pipe. Not only had it arrived late, but its placement turned out to be especially challenging. It needed to be welded deep inside a narrow, elevated utility shaft. Therefore, the space was simply difficult to access without specialized equipment and had little to no ventilation. Normally, this kind of task would fall to certified plumbers trained in electrofusion welding. This method works by heating a metal coil embedded within the pipe fitting until it melts the surrounding polyethylene, forming a seamless, pressure-tight joint. But in this case, the certified team refused to proceed without proper scaffolding or secure footing. They considered the task unsafe. That's when the job was passed to a different crew, a team from Whitewater, the Canadian subcontractor that had manufactured the slide itself. While they were deeply familiar with the structure overall, they weren't certified to perform electrofusion welding on site. Still, Still, with schedules tightening and pressure building to meet deadlines, the decision was made to let them proceed. By the time Patrik reached the 5th floor, the weld was already underway 2 levels below. Once there, he began his routine checks, inspecting cable mounts, reviewing fixture alignments, and walking through mechanical access corridors. Meanwhile, inside the shaft, things weren't going according to plan. Since the pipe ends hadn't been properly aligned, a small but critical gap remained between them. As the embedded coil began to heat, that gap caused the system to overcompensate, overheating the weld zone. And instead of fusing the plastic cleanly, the coil began to scorch it from the inside out, slowly and silently. Yet on the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, right up until 8:30 a.m., when some of the crews on the lower floors began to notice a strange smell. It was faint, something between warm plastic and scorched wiring. Ultimately, most simply assumed it was a fan motor overheating, or a minor short in the electrical system. And so they continued working. Still, roughly 12 minutes later, at 8:42 a.m., another sign appeared. This time, a thin white trail drifting upward from one of the tower's vertical pipe vents. It resembled steam, and at first glance didn't seem unusual. After all, condensation was common on a cold morning, especially at a water park. But what they were seeing wasn't steam. It was the first visible sign that the heat inside the shaft had reached the surrounding materials, and as the temperature crept upward, it began to affect the insulation lining the cavity. The foam inside the wall ignited, and a small flame escaped upward through the vent outlet, catching onto nearby cladding. Within seconds, the smoke changed color, shifting from light vapor to thick, dark gray, and that was when full-blown panic broke out. Workers outside the tower shouted for extinguishers, while others rushed to grab their radios and phones. Meanwhile, inside on the 5th floor, Patrik was still making his way through access zones, and since the voices outside had sharpened, he could sense something was wrong. Suddenly, his phone rang. The person on the line asked if he had seen anything strange. Patrik replied that he could smell burning plastic and was heading down to check. But at that very moment, heat and pressure had been building inside the shaft far faster than anyone realized. The combination of scorched plastic, synthetic insulation, and rising gases had turned the shaft into a pressurized corridor. When that pressure reached its threshold, ignition followed, and in an instant, the shaft erupted. The blast tore through internal panels, blowing out sections of the tower's exterior and launching debris down onto the site below. And just as it happened, the call with Patrik abruptly cut off. In mere seconds, the fire spread. The internal layers of the tower, packed with cladding and insulated cavities, began to fuel the blaze. Meanwhile, the shaft's vertical layout worked like a chimney, pulling in oxygen and pushing heat upward. The fire department, already alerted by earlier calls about smoke, was now seeing the full plume rise over Gothenburg. The column reached high into the sky, visible for kilometers, and even traffic along the nearby highway began to slow as drivers looked up in disbelief. When responders finally reached the building, the fire was fully engaged, and by mid-morning, the entire construction site had been transformed into a sealed-off disaster zone. While police cordoned off the area, emergency vehicles filled the surrounding streets and set up a temporary medical station nearby. In total, 16 workers were treated for smoke inhalation, 2 of whom were transported to the hospital. Yet in the midst of the chaos, one question remained unanswered. What happened to Patrik Gillholm? Some believed he might have made it out, but was simply unreachable. Others assumed he had stayed behind to coordinate evacuations or assist emergency crews. But as the hours passed and his phone remained silent, all hope began to fade. By that afternoon, the fire was still smoldering. The building's internal systems, many still incomplete or untested, offered no aid in locating missing personnel. And while Patrik's last known position had been on the 5th floor, the stairwell he'd used was destroyed, and structural engineers now warned that sections of the tower had become unstable. Therefore, entering was simply too dangerous. Meanwhile, Patrik's family stood just beyond the emergency perimeter, and his wife, Teresa, and their children, Tuva and Albin. They waited through the night, hoping for news, yet unfortunately received none, because no one could even confirm whether Patrik was still inside. Still, deep down, many had already begun to understand what the eventual answer would be, one that wouldn't come for another 4 days. On February 16th, once engineers had stabilized key parts of the tower, the search teams were finally permitted inside. Almost immediately, they found Patrik near what remained of the 5th floor, close to an emergency corridor, partially shielded by a wall that had buckled in the blast. Unfortunately, he showed no signs of life, and the official cause of death could only be recorded as carbon monoxide poisoning. Investigators believe Patrik had stayed low and attempted to find an exit route, perhaps even trying to use a radio or phone to relay information. But unfortunately, the toxic gases produced by burning foam and plastic filled the space faster than he could escape. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Sweden's Accident Investigation Authority launched a formal inquiry, and over the following weeks, they traced every decision, every subcontract, and every misstep that had contributed to the disaster. The origin of the fire was traced to that very same incorrectly executed electrofusion weld on the polyethylene pipe, carried out by uncertified workers. On top of that, the joint itself had been misaligned, and that seemingly small detail created an air gap which caused the heating coil to overcompensate, overheat, and gradually ignite the surrounding plastic, triggering a smoldering fire inside the wall cavity. Another critical factor was the lack of an active fire detection system. It turned out that the temporary alarm network that had protected the site earlier in the project had been dismantled just days before. The new permanent system was already installed, but still operating in test mode. It could collect data, but not trigger alarms, and as a result, no warning sound in those early minutes when the fire could have been stopped. It's often assumed that amusement parks pose the greatest danger to thrill-seeking visitors, and statistically, that perception holds some truth. In Florida's Walt Disney World alone, around 65 guest fatalities have been recorded over the years of its operation. But as the case of Patrik Gillholm makes perfectly clear, it's often the employees, even the most experienced ones, who face the highest risks, especially when workplace safety is neglected. And sadly, this case was far from unique. Just 1 year after the Oceana fire, in the summer of 2025, 44-year-old Ronald Andrew Bacchiera Jr. was working on a water park construction site in Goodyear, Arizona. Assigned to a nearly 2-meter deep trench, he was buried alive when the walls suddenly collapsed. His body was recovered after 12 hours, and investigators later confirmed the trench lacked the proper reinforcements that could have prevented the collapse, a basic safety measure that was never implemented. A few years earlier, in 2022, a 30-year-old employee at a Western-themed amusement park in the United States was killed in an equally shocking incident. While riding a scooter across the park grounds, he struck a gate that had been secured with a nylon strap instead of a proper latch. Ultimately, the makeshift fix failed. The gate swung out, and the resulting crash led to fatal injuries. And in 2012, at La Ronde Amusement Park in Montreal, a seasoned maintenance technician was performing a routine inspection near the Vampire roller coaster. But due to a critical communication breakdown between ride operators and maintenance staff, the ride had been shut down. The worker entered a restricted area during live operation and was fatally struck by an oncoming train. Behind every one of these tragedies lies the same conclusion. The blame did not rest with the victims, but with the parks whose negligence cost them their lives, just as it did in Patrik's case. For months after the Oceana incident, the entire site remained closed. Every contractor, supervisor, and government agency involved was required to submit documentation, and yet despite multiple failures, not one was ever held legally responsible. Furthermore, the city ultimately decided to resume the Oceana project. So, by 2025, construction was once again underway. This time under rigorous new oversight. The city appointed an independent safety firm to supervise the site, and every team underwent comprehensive training in emergency procedures. Revised schedules set clear milestones, and, most critically, the fire protection systems were installed and activated much earlier in the process, rather than being postponed until the final stages of the build. The park is now scheduled to open in 2026, but no matter how polished the finished architecture may appear, many residents will never look at Oceana the same way again. And Patrik Gillholm, who had dedicated himself to the project, never lived to see the water park completed. Now tell me, are any of you watching this video from Gothenburg? And if so, are you planning to visit this park once it finally opens? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that reveal the darker side of even the brightest places.